All right. So there are 3 solution-oriented mini talks before we go today. So I appreciate all of your patience and focus as we get through what is a lot of information. But hopefully you will be integrating and aggregating and contemplating this for a whole year before we come back together again. All right, so I am so pleased. A lot of you have probably seen, because I personally and Fibershed as an organization have been promoting this really beautiful holistic project that has come forward from the North Face, whose headquarters are actually in Alameda. They're either a company that is near and dear to my heart because they're local and I can go talk to them and I can talk to them about the industry and what's happening, and some of my friends have worked there, and so I just have that, those personal connections. And the project you've probably seen, but I won't talk too much about it. I'll let Carol do that. But we have been working with this facet of the climate beneficial wool economy and how to amplify that program. And so through the work of the folks at North Face, they have taken an interest in the soil-to-soil model, in the metrics around how to measure soil carbon and how to think about carbon through the life of a garment and how to actually use a local material. And so I don't want to go into too much depth because I'd like the points to actually be communicated by Carol. But I'll just say I'm so glad you're here, and thank you for all the work and kinship that you've provided between a company and a nonprofit. So thank you. Yeah, and so if you talk like super close. Yes.
Hi, everyone. Oh, awesome. I felt really self-conscious about my breath for some reason, so I have a mint right now. No one's going to smell my breath, but I'm from the North Face. I'm on the sustainability team there, and I'm here to talk about the climate beneficial wool beanie that Margot Hayes, one of our athletes, is wearing in this picture. Just to set the stage a little bit, the Cali Wool Beanie is actually part of our Backyard Project collection. The Backyard Project was started in 2014 when Rebecca came to our office and said, what do you think about creating a naturally colored cotton hoodie locally? And that's the first picture you have here, that hoodie. That was a collaboration with Fibershed, Sally Fox, the Sustainable Cotton Project, Lydia, who spoke earlier. A really wonderful collaborative project, and out of that we got this beanie. And we didn't actually meet our challenge to create the hoodie locally. That was defined as 150 miles of our headquarters. Some of the processes, as you all know, we just don't have near us. So the spinning, for instance, had to be done in the Carolinas, but we were really proud that most of it was done locally. And then over the next 2 years, we worked on scaling that project because, similar to what Ryan said earlier, we want to get this out to the masses, not just the folks who are already interested in these types of textile systems. So those next 2 collections were how we scaled the project. We grew it from a single hoodie to t-shirts, pullover zips, baseball tees, and then Rebecca came to us again, along with Crystal, and she said, hey, we've got this amazing climate beneficial wool. Are you guys interested? And of course we were interested, and so we started on a new project, creating a product out of that. And I will also add that this was, for me personally, it was such a fun opportunity to get to work with Fibershed. I came just a little bit after the Backyard Project had launched, but I'd also gone to UC Davis, similar to Gabby, and learned about Fibershed when I was in my grad program, and always wanted an opportunity to work with them, so this was amazing for me. This is a very simplified graphic of the carbon cycle. It's definitely more complicated. We modified Rebecca's amazing cycle graphic, soil-to-soil graphic, for our consumers. So this is on the hang tag of our beanies to explain what exactly climate beneficial wool is. Basically, you have sheep that are grazing on rangelands. Their grazing stimulates plant growth. You want to make sure they're not overgrazing a certain plot of land. That's why we say careful grazing. And then the plants sequester carbon dioxide, obviously, And a really important part of the carbon farming process is applying compost to the rangelands. That's leading to additional CO2 sequestration, and then you also have more soil, or more moisture in the soil. The health of the soil improves, and then you have happier sheep that are grazing on this really healthy land, and the cycle continues. And then from those sheep, we get the wool for our beanies. And the wool for our beanies came from Lonnie's ranch, Bear Ranch, she's back there. And the carbon farm plan for her ranch is expected to lead to sequestering 4,000 metric tons of CO2 each year. That's pretty amazing. That's the equivalent emissions of about 850 passenger vehicles being driven for a year. And according to her carbon farm plan, that would offset the emissions associated with her wool production 6 to 9 times that amount. So this is really exciting for the North Face because this is the first time we worked with a material that's net negative in terms of carbon, right? When you think about switching from a virgin material, if it's polyester or cotton, switching that to a recycled one, you're really cutting that impact, maybe like by 50% or 60%. This is a net negative material. Oops. Oh, sorry. Go back. Can I go back? Oh, yeah. So when we started working on this project, we had to identify a wool supply chain here in the United States, which is not an easy task. At our scale, it was difficult to find some of these players. And we got our wool from Bear Ranch, and that's a really beautiful greasy rambouillet wool. From there, that wool went to Chargers in South Carolina, where they washed it and cleaned out, the bits and pieces of agricultural product, and we got comb top from them. And Chargers is actually the last large-scale industrial wool top maker in the United States. They were started in 1955. From there, the comb top went to National Spinning in North Carolina, and National Spinning is pretty amazing because they're actually employee-owned, and they've been operating since the 1920s. They spun our wool top into yarn, and then from there, the yarn went to Artex Knitting Mill in New Jersey. And Artex, similar to National, was started in the 1920s. They're a family-owned company, and they are one of the last large-scale knitting mills left in the country as well. And they took our yarn, they dyed it into a color, asphalt gray, and they also knit the beanies. And this is our natural, undyed beanie right here. So just some key takeaways from this project that I think are important are that I'm really happy to report that this beanie is the #1 selling beanie on our website. Like, that's huge. I was very relieved. It shows that there's a demand for really high quality USA-made wool products. And the other takeaway from this project is just similar to the original backyard hoodie. This is such a collaborative effort. Rebecca helped us so much with identifying supply chain partners. Lonnie was such a wonderful partner. Crystal, without Crystal helping us with this, I'm not sure we would have gotten very far. So I think one of the best things about Fibershed and this community of people is really the collaboration that can happen if you put your heart and your time and effort into it. And just some other stats are that we did a pretty well-integrated marketing campaign for this beanie. We had an email blast, social media campaign, it was in our catalog, and across all of those channels, this beanie performed above average. So, yay. Thank you guys.
And our next mini presentation, thank you, Carol. Nick Wenner, are you here? Come on up. So I had the pleasure of working with Nick in the Indigo fields. We grew a test plot thanks to the Jenna and Michael King Foundation research grant. We were able to actually do a conservation tillage program at Black Mountain, not so far from here. And throughout a summer, while leaving untilled areas in between the indigo, we got to see how productive these landscapes could be. It was a very compacted horse pasture. We grew indigo and coreopsis and food crops. It was a very small setting, but it was a test case for how we could experiment with different extraction processes for the indigo. And it's a project that I've kind of been waiting to do for almost 7 or 8 years personally, and I never really had an opportunity to weave my personal love of blue kind of actually into a research framework. And so moving from the garden scale and moving from the small farm scale into this vision of how to scale. And so that was the question. And with the help of Calla Rose, Ostrander, and Matt Forkin, who's not here, I just want to shout out to them. The True Blue Project came together. And Nick Wenner today, who is going to actually present on some of the research in motion and outcomes around really creating True Blue. Thank you.
I'll have to have this up here for notes. And I have a clicky.
You have a clicky.
Which one do I click? That one. Okay.
And talk really close.
Hello, everyone. My name's Nicholas Wenner, and I'm going to be presenting to you the True Blue Project. And I've been working as a lead engineer for this project for the last 1.5 years, and the goals were to assess the economic and technical feasibility of bioregional indigo dye production and to build a foundation for the local industry. And this has been more? Okay.
You might need to hold that with your hand. Yeah.
This has been through field research, in-depth analysis on planting, harvesting, and dye production. And it stems out of the Grow Your Genes project that Fibershed took part in 2015. And all local genes produced and made almost entirely in the area. And really the goal of this project is how do we scale this? So with indigo dye, there are 2 main types from plants, pigment and compost. And the example of compost would be sukamo in the Japanese tradition. And pigment is more pure. It has about 40% indigo pigment, along with other impurities from the plant. And it would take about 1/10 of a pound of that to dye 1 pound of cotton. Whereas compost is about 3% indigo and 1.2 pounds to dye 1 pound of indigo. So in soil-to-soil indigo production, it can go from planting to harvesting to dye production, and then ideally compost those garments and continue the cycle again. And you can see on the dye production there are these 2 tracks, one leading to the pigment and one to the compost. And the way to think about that is the indigo is contained, the precursor to the indigo dye is contained in the leaves of the plant. And with the water extraction process going towards pigment, you extract that into water, form the pigment there, separate it, filter it, and dry it. In the compost process, the pigment is formed inside the leaves, inside the structure of those cells, and then the leaves are composted away to concentrate it down. The Grow Your Genes project used the compost process, and that was all by hand. So things were planted by hand, harvested by hand, and composted on a compost floor that's based on a traditional Japanese design, and that involves a minimum of 440 pounds of leaves to have enough mass to hold the heat, composted over the course of 100 days, and that's with weekly turning, so really labor intensive. And similar on the dyeing side, it was inspired in the Japanese tradition in a fermentation, so requiring about 20 pounds minimum with 7-day or so startup, careful tending, and additions of materials to get it to go. In our area, there was also ongoing experience with creating pigment. Corey Hargraves is one local artisan who was working with that. It's compact and concentrated and consistent but while promising, it was not widely understood or practiced in our region. So the question was which process to use and how do we scale it and is it economical? Okay, so we ran a bunch of experiments and I'll tell you about those now. We're working with Japanese indigo, Polygonum tinctorium. There are a lot of different indigo plants, indigo-bearing plants. This is one that grows really well here. And this season we worked with Craig Wilkinson, a local farmer, at Open Field Farm in Petaluma. And after working with Craig on the 10th acre plot and building some dangerous-looking prototypes, and where should I be pointing this? That way. Okay. And turning my kitchen into a mad scientist laboratory. We have a bunch of results that I'd like to share with you now. On the planting side of things, we successfully planted using tractor-mounted transplanters, and these can be used for a variety of purposes on a farm, planting many different crops. It took a process that might have taken 40 hours per acre down to about 10 hours per acre. And these machines are $1,500 to $6,000, depending. On harvesting, we identified two options, one which would require modification, the plot combine, which is a small research-scale grain harvesting machine. And if you remove the threshing components, it would be capable of harvesting the indigo quickly, $6,000 to $8,000 with the modification. And then there are other machines that are custom built for very similar purposes, a lavender harvester for $23,000, and that could harvest an acre in as little as an hour and a half. On the composting side of things, I mentioned the Japanese-inspired process, which takes a lot of labor and a large minimum size to go. We were interested in industrial methods of composting where you can turn and aerate and heat the compost pile, and it seems a little silly to automate a natural process, but what it allowed us to do on a bench scale test was to take that 440 pounds, 5 minutes, okay, I'll speed up, down to 1 pound minimum, 3 months down to 1 month, and it drastically decreased labor. Dyeing with compost, we wanted to make a much more accessible process, working with Michel Garcia, a French dye master. Compost, fructose, lime, as in calcium hydroxide, and wood ash allowed us to almost instantly dye with the compost. It was safe, down to 1 pound minimum, much more accessible process. And there's still certainly a place for fermentation, but this can sit next to it. There's a piece designed by Ashley Eva Brock, and done in a compost vat. It was at the Fashion Gala. On the water extraction side of things, a lot of research developing a theoretical foundation and practical understanding. We optimized that process and scaled up to 100 gallons, which got us really good estimates of yield and what we can expect. So that much pigment in that mason jar came from that much plants, which was about 60 row feet fitting into that 100-gallon tank. And so it's really precious stuff. We took all this and created models and thought about how we would scale this up. We chose 2.5 acres as a reasonable target to scale up from our 10th acre, and a place that gave something feasible for a small-scale farmer and also economic viability. And so water extraction would involve 2 very large tanks, hoists, heaters, pumps, and filters, and the capital expenditure would be about $100,000, which includes the harvesting equipment, all the agricultural irrigation supplies, etc., and it could handle 2.5 acres. The compost system would have a bit more machinery, and it would involve a dryer, a winnower, and a composter. Winnow the leaves off of the stems, dry them, and compost them over the course of a month. It would be about $150K, including all the agricultural materials, and handle about 2.5 acres. So we took all that, and the point is not to read that. We made lots of models and lots of details and all the costs. We tried to capture them. And what we got was that we could produce something like 66 to 120 pounds per acre per year of pigment, 450 to 800 pairs of jeans, or 2,600 pounds per acre per year, 1,500 pairs of jeans. that could dye. And there's quite a range on the pigment because we got research testing results back just 2 days ago that I'm still trying to figure out how to incorporate. And that's that we compared our pigment against Stony Creek, which is the only other producer in the United States of indigo on a scale out of Tennessee. And visually our pigment looks very much the same. The results we got back was that it was about half as pure. And so figuring out what that means. And in the following slides, what I've done is I've shown sort of a best case and a worst case scenario for that. And that's with the economic modeling. And so the first thing to look at would be break-even price. What would somebody need to sell this pigment at so that they could at least recover their costs? And we have dollars per pound and acres. So with the pigment, $104 to $188 per pound compared to Stony Creek, who sells at $86 to $177. We're in the range, but certainly on the high end. That translates to $16 to $28 for the dye for a pair of jeans. On the compost side of things, it's $7 a pound compared to currently being sold at $65 by those doing it in that manual process. It's about $12 for the dye for a pair of jeans. It's a bit comparing apples to oranges because they have different levels of indigo, but if you control for that and say, what if it was 100%? These are the prices per pound for compost at $220, and then pigment $260 to $470, and Stony Creek would be $250 to $442. So again, you see the pigment is in there but high, and much more well within the range for the compost. If you chose one price, $375 for pure indigo, that's $150 for pigment, or $12 a pound for compost. You could make as much as $32,000 a year with the compost and return that $150 investment in 4.7 years. If a farmer was paying his or herself the labor to grow it all, profit plus labor is $54,000 per year. So these questions: which process to use, how do we scale it, and is it economical? The pigment is technically feasible, and it's a little unclear whether it's going to be economically viable given these recent test results that we'll be incorporating and sharing in upcoming reports. On the compost side of things, it's both technically feasible and economically viable. And we see that as a really strong foundation for a local industry. And I just want to step out into the global scale of things. There's something like 180 million pounds of indigo produced and used globally per year. And if you were to grow that all with plant-based indigo, it would require an area the size of Sonoma and Mendocino counties combined. And so that's a large area, but maybe not so large if you think about spreading that around the entire world and supplying all of the indigo. On the economic side of things, it's a bit of a different story. Synthetic indigo comes 95% pure as opposed to maximum about 40. It retails at $2.50 a pound. And thinking about true cost, and it retails at $2.50 a pound. And that's an 80th the cost of the best case scenario. And so it's clear that botanical indigo is not just a stand-in for the status quo and how things are done, and that there need to be other shifts alongside this to get us where we're trying to go to. And if every American owns something like 7 pairs of jeans on average, and there's 7.5 billion people in the world, it's not the way that we make our jeans may not be the only solution to be thinking about. And there are other cultural shifts that are really important, and bringing it back home and paying the true cost are certainly part of that. So that's what we're here to support, and we'll be releasing 3 reports from the website. It's all open source, and one, an overview, a lot of what I've been speaking today with more detail about indigo, details of planting and harvesting, and dye production with compost and the water extraction process. So those will be outgoing, and our goal is to land this into a local business as soon as possible. And this is about bioregional small business. We'd like to see it in our Fibershed and others everywhere. And so if anyone is interested in investing in that infrastructure, we invite them to speak with us. And thank you all. Yes. Well, that would be with the compost process, and you would actually be running that composter through the year. You would dry your leaves and then be running it through the year. So it would be the 54,000 per year labor plus profit with a compost process. Yeah, it would be running through the year, but it wouldn't be active. You would just be loading the composter every month. So it would be 3 to 4 months. It would be from planting to harvesting. So early spring to late fall, pretty active, and then the rest of the time loading the composter.
And so a follow-up question then, what's the utilization rate of the equipment? Could it go service other operations?
I think certainly, yeah. Yeah.
So that investment could actually yield incomes for multiple operations.
Right. The question was, could you service other areas with that equipment while it's not being used? And a lot of those different equipments could be useful in a lot of different places, and we're very interested in cooperative structures and finding those win-wins.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One more.
Where can you get seed for Japanese indigo?
Where can you get seed for Japanese indigo?
Corey and Craig.
Corey Hargraves.
There's a few sources listed in our report.
There will be sources listed in the report.
Which one's on the website now?
It's in the one that's online, the growing and harvesting report.
That's online.
Oh, right. The overview document is already posted on the website, and you can find sources there and also info about dyeing and indigo in general.
Fibershed.org. And Craig, you want to raise your hand?
And there's Craig. Craig grew all the indigo, and we couldn't have done any of this without him. Are you also selling seed?
Yeah.
I'll have seed this year, yeah. And so it would probably be through the Fibershed marketplace.
Yeah, part of the co-op.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
All right, you're all mentally amazing people. We have one final presentation, and it's by Stephany Wilkes, who is also on the board of the new Ag Co-op, and she is also the one who stood by Matt and Sarah Gilbert along their process funding their mill. She's been the undergirding and support for so many projects. Silicon Valley to sheep shearer. And in Vogue magazine for it all.
Okay, it's the end of the day and you're cozy and you're yawning, so this is the time we want to talk about accounting, right? Let me see if I can work my clicker right. I also have the most basic slides. So I'm going to talk to you about the money behind a lot of the projects that you've heard today, because I love to talk about money. How are we paying for all of this, right? Because it's not just materials that we're trying to get into the system. It's what we count, as we've seen, and what we pay for it, right? How do we pay? This is a picture inside of Houston Textile of the climate beneficial wool fabric, which is available for pre-order in the back from Lonnie. Let me see. Okay, so Fibershed and the USDA Value Added Producers Grant Program funded a study between November-ish of last year and June of this year, and it was also an economic feasibility study. I don't have a ton of photos, because if I did, they would be spreadsheets and profit and loss statements. And the big question of the study was, can prices, product design, and consumer demand come together in ways that increase revenue for wool producers? Let us not lose sight of this key thing, right? Because if folks aren't making a living, we're not going to have the materials that we need. So I'm going to tell you 3 things that we tried to change those financial systems that were studied as part of this study. The first one is a price premium. And this means paying producers more than the usually low commodity price for their wool in recognition of their climate beneficial land practices. In the study, the premium was 60 cents per pound more of wool than the average commodity price. And that number might vary depending on things like wool quality and fineness. It just means for a premium, something above and beyond the rancher's usually low price. That's all you really need to know. The higher price was described as a game changer by many of the people who received it. The tricky bit is in how that wool price, the premium, is handled accounting-wise. So here we're going to get into the financial bits of the traditional textile system a little bit. So one example would be a bedding business that makes wool comforters would buy raw wool directly from the grower, and they would write a check to that wool grower directly, and they'd pay for the full amount of the typical wool price plus the premium. So let's say the wool is normally $1.90 a pound on the commodity price. They would pay 60 cents additional, or $2.50 a pound, right? You with me? So that, in that case, the grower is getting that premium up front to implement their own carbon farm plans on their land. But this doesn't work for all businesses, namely some of those big textile businesses that we saw today. And Lydia touched on this morning about why. About cutting pennies away from the farmers and making money for Bloomingdale's down the line. So in the traditional textile supply chain, paying more for raw wool increases the processing costs at every subsequent step. This is something called Keystone Markup. So it's when a product sells for at least twice the price for which it was purchased. And it is pretty standard in the fashion industry. And I'm going to give you, I have 10 minutes, so I have to be really fast. We could go into Keystone Markup. I'm sure there's like whole business classes about it. But it adds cost to the supply chain by increasing the price at every stage. So if you buy $1 a pound for raw wool, it means the next vendor in the supply chain pays $2, which becomes $4, and on and on and on. And all I want you to know about this is that it creates an incentive to start with the lowest possible price, right? You have a disincentive to pay more for raw material, even if in the businesses we spoke with as part of the study, they want to, and they believe they should. This is not a malicious thing. It's like a money thing, right? So what's another way we can create to handle that price premium and pay the farmers a higher amount of money for their product? You could handle it as a donation to a carbon farm fund administered by a trustworthy entity, maybe like Fibershed or another nonprofit, that would let the company write a check for that $1.90 a pound, typical commodity low price that they're used to, and then another check for that 60-cent premium price. And that could go into a fund and get passed back to the producers. The company gets to realize that, I don't have to tell you, as a tax write-off for a donation to a nonprofit, and then that can come back to the farmer. And it needs some refinement, right? So I'm not saying this is perfect, but perfect is not always our goal. We want to scale to include wool brokers. So right now, a lot of people, especially with a lot of sheep, sell their raw wool through a broker like Roswell or Utah Marketing, and that is how those big textile folks tend to buy that wool. It's raw in the bale. So we've got to have a way when it's sold at 100,000 pound lots to, consider how we would get that price premium processed for carbon farming so that we can get more climate beneficial raw wool into the system. And also get the folks funded. There's also an interesting thing about time, which is that a lot of these practices benefit us for a really, really long time. And folks from the Marine Carbon Project have spoken here before about, how a scant quarter-inch application of compost applied one time can actually increase the soil system's ability to sequester carbon for like 100 years. So even, a farmer doesn't need to apply compost every year, forever and ever and ever to have tremendous payoff, but the wool was sold that 1 year. So what do we do about that? So those are some questions we need to think about for the future. The next one was carbon farming costs. Okay, so before you can set your premium of 60 cents more a pound, you need to know what carbon farming costs, because is your premium going to even be enough to cover what you're making? How on earth do you know? So we took a stab at figuring that out and trying to systematize that a bit and make a tool that we hope will be useful for other folks. So I looked for best available data. I've been a researcher for a long time, best available data. And the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service has reimbursement costs that they give to farms and ranches for implementing conservation practices, which you and I have also heard called carbon farm practices, right? And there's a long list of these conservation practices, and they have specified rates by state per year for the practice. So for example, nutrient management, practice code 590, replacing nitrogen fertilizer with soil amendments. And for that, the NRCS reimburses at $16.50 an acre in California in 2017. So this doesn't really tell us, though, oh, is that enough money? We just know they do it. But we also have some actual data from ranchers like Lonnie and other folks who have started to implement carbon farm practices on their land. So we can delta between the actuals and the reimbursement rates and estimate what that price premium may have to make up, right? So let's say, John, wait, I'm looking at John because this is a made-up number. Let's say it took 2,000 acres, cost $38,000 to do nutrient practice 590, right? It was tractor, it was buying the compost, it was human labor to spread the compost, it was $38,000. If I looked at the NRCS table, that $16.50 an acre times 2,000 is $33,000. We know the difference between those numbers is $5,000. That helps us set a price premium for the wool harvest in that year that we would need the rancher to realize. So we have to be talking in reality, right? Because that's the reality to the rancher's wallet. Last one, practice number 3, is a CSA-style prepayment model for textiles. So this is something that's pretty popular in the food movement, right? Is that you can be a member of a farm, you can buy a subscription box, but does it work for fabric and for our clothes? And how would it need to be the same and how would it need to be different? And again, the pre-order fabric, we're still doing this the second year, so you know it wasn't a total failure because we're doing it again and you can pre-order today. So for fabric, the season's a little different. And here we cover the fabric production cost, right? So we're saying you pre-order fabric today by the yard, and Houston Textile weaves that and it ships in February. People are totally willing to do this, right? I bought some last year, the fabric sold out, it was great. So we know that's good. But it didn't work equally well for everybody. And time is a variable. So there's this truing up we need to do between the fashion calendars and the shearing and fiber production calendars. So fashion folks have seasons. They do March and fall, spring and fall fashion weeks, and they make sample garments, and people order those, right? Big manufacturers or Bloomingdale's, they order based on samples, and then the designer gets money. Well, the shearing happens in May, and the fabric might not be woven until February, and the pre-orders might not come until the fall, right? So if you're with me, there's a lot that happens between May and February that we need to pay for. So imagine the rancher. Rancher shears, they pay the shearer. They're out that money. They want to make fabric. They're going to hold that wool. They're not going to sell it raw. Well, that's missed income too, isn't it? They could have sold it at auction raw. Now they're not, that's more money they're not getting. So they're going to hold that inventory. They're going to carry that risk themselves. Then they're going to sell a pre-order. Pre-orders will come in for months. They've paid freight to ship it to chargeurs. They've paid all the processing costs we saw. Anyway, I'll spare you the details. It's tens of thousands of dollars to make 700 to 900 yards of fabric, even at these prices of $45 wholesale yard and $55 wholesale yard. So the pre-order for the fabric works great. We know folks are willing to prepay, but we might want to look at covering more things like maybe before sharing. And also concepts like bridge financing, where designers who really want to get their hands on this material, but they don't have the money in their wallets until after Fashion Week, could express some intent or another way to get the fibers that they want. So those are the things we're doing to look at how we handle money a little differently in this system that we're kind of, we're in the transitional period, and that's why it feels icky right now. Because we wouldn't redesign the system that we have, but we don't quite know exactly the new one. So that's what we're trying to figure out. Thanks for bearing with me.
Before we go, any questions for Stephany? Oh, there is one. Yep.
Yes, Hazel.
It's not so much for you, Stephany, but just to say, with everything we've heard today, we're talking about fashion, but a lot of this climate beneficial wool is getting turned into bedding. And it is just as important that we think about what we're putting next to our skin when we're asleep as the clothes that we wear.
100%.
Keep in mind that we are making climate beneficial comforters.
Oh, yes. That's true. Shame on me. The wool bedding company that I mentioned was not a hypothetical. It's in the back of the room. And they paid the price premium for the wool. So the anonymity of the study is off. It's Hazel in the back. Marie.
We do fashion things, but it's really important that we consider this too. And a lot of the wool grown in this area, rather than up where Lonnie is more suitable for bedding.
100% true.
And we had 5,000 pounds of it washed and carded last year, which was ours and Lauren Punch's and Jim Jensen's, and it all went off together as a collaborative project. We still have a lot of that wool left. We're selling it all the time, making it up like this or selling it as bags. But in terms of people wanting to support what we're doing, we've got probably 3,000 pounds of wool left that you can buy in one form or another. Maybe just 2,000 by now.
Yeah, and Hazel's point is really important, right? Is that a huge finding from the study, which I didn't touch on here because I was focused on true cost accounting, is that everybody needs a market. And that is a huge reason behind the ag co-op that was announced earlier today, and the Fibershed marketplace that will be coming back that we've received funding to do, because there needs to be an easier way to find all of this. If you are not here today, you cannot find it. We need to make it, it feels kind of underground, which I kind of like I have all the cool stuff, but we need a better market for our farmers and ranchers and better and easier ways to find these things, not just for manufacturers, but for everybody here.
I just want to say thank you to you all for spending this much time on a Saturday to come and learn and commune, really, with those who grow your clothing and your bedding. And I have a bedding order in with Hazel, and you can too. So I hope you all have a beautiful rest of your weekend, and thank you. Oh, yeah. And you can stay for another hour and hang out. Shop.